Currently, women are flooding the streets of Iran screaming Jinjian Azadi. These three words translate to women, life, freedom, and have many in the Iranian government nervous about what the future may hold. For too long, women have been oppressed in the country, and it seems like this very moment may be a crucial turning point in history. The truth is, Iran has not always been this way. Women used to enjoy much more freedom in the country. The revolution that looms on the horizon could tear down the oppressive laws that have ensnared the nation since 1979, and it will be women who lead the charge. Before we can understand what's happening at this moment in time, we need to look back at Iran's history. Iran has undergone several drastic changes over the centuries, just like every country around the world. However, what you don't know about this region will not only shock you, but change the way you think about the past, present, and future. Sometime between 13 and 1400 years ago, Islam came to the part of the Middle East that would eventually become Iran. However, before this happened, this part of the world was progressive in many ways, even by today's standards. The religion followed by many at the time was called Zoroastrianism, and it provided a framework for a society that considered men and women much more equal than the current interpretation of Islam in Iran today. It's important to make one point very clear from the beginning. The problems in Iran are not the result of the Islamic faith. They have been caused by people who pervert the teachings of Islam and bend them to their own ideologies. Oftentimes, this has been done in order for certain people to stay in power. Just like not every Christian believes the earth was created 4,000 years ago and every word in the Bible must be strictly followed, not every Muslim believes women should be repressed and the Quran should be interpreted literally. It's only extremists who are afraid of losing their power or seeing society change that use these types of strict religious arguments to justify their actions. Unfortunately, in Iran and several other parts of the world, this practice has been going on for a long time and has resulted in the oppression of many people, including women, minorities, and anyone with different beliefs. Before this shift in ideology came about in Iran, women were able to hold leadership roles in the government and other decision-making bodies. They could be high-ranking commanders in the military and even rule as queens in certain circumstances. Everything was not perfect before the 700s, but the laws and belief systems in the region were much more liberal and progressive than some of the laws in place today. So, what happened and how did we get here? Again, we'll say this one more time in case we're not clear before. It's not because of the Islamic faith, but it very much is because of the people in power. Although there might be another player involved that might shock you or might not, depending on how much you know about the CIA. During the time of Zoroastrianism, there were still plenty of wars, strife, and persecution in Iran. However, overall, there were more freedoms and equality between the two sexes. Things obviously weren't perfect, but it seems like society was evolving in a way that would make it more inclusive. When the Islamic faith swept through the Middle East, there were still rulers, emperors, and queens, as there had been before, but religion became centered around the Quran and the teachings of Muhammad. In the coming centuries, Iranians would defend their homeland from invading forces such as the Mongols and the Europeans trying to colonize the region. Just like the rest of the world, peace was hard to come by. And by the 20th century, Iran was in a similar position as many other nations that had resources European countries wanted. During the 19th century, Iran came under the influence of Russia for several decades after the Russo-Persian War ended in 1828. However, it was in 1921 when a military commander by the name of Reza Khan seized power that the foundation for modern Iran was set. In 1925, Reza Khan became the Shah, or ruler of the country, similar to the old dynastic kings that had absolute power from centuries before, and became known as Reza Shah Pahlavi. It was in 1935 that the country formally adopted Iran as its official name. Iran still wasn't completely autonomous, as Britain and other major European powers still had an interest in the nation's oil fields. When World War II broke out, Reza Shah Pahlavi declared that Iran would remain neutral even though Britain ordered him to expel German engineers and technicians working on the oil fields in Iran. This decision didn't end well for Pahlavi, and when the Allies defeated the Nazis, he was removed from his position by British and Soviet forces. His son, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, succeeded him as ruler of Iran. Although the Shah held much of the power in the country and even expanded his control over many aspects of Iran's policies, other bodies within the government tried to maintain some semblance of power. In 1951, nationalist Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh tried to nationalize the oil industry, which Britain had a large stake in at the time. Since the Shah was put into power by Britain, he opposed this idea and tried to remove Mossadegh from power. However, he failed and the Shah was forced to flee Iran. But 2 years later, the Shah came back when General Fazlollah Zahedi overthrew Mossadegh in a coup. It was here where things got a little questionable. Zahedi had a little help from an outside source, a player up until that point that had not interfered in Iran. General Fazlollah Zahedi was able to procure the men, intel, and weapons necessary to overthrow Mossadegh because he was backed by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. And as history has shown, when the CIA gets involved in the internal politics of a country, things don't always go to plan. Once Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi was put back into power, the United States and Israeli intelligence worked with the Shah to set up SAVAK. This became Iran's intelligence organization, which would later be used to do terrible things such as torturing and executing political opposition, as well as suppressing any dissent. Having an arm of the government whose job it was to enforce the will of the Shah would give later regimes the ability to oppress certain groups, such as women and minorities. However, in 1963, things were starting to look up in Iran. The Shah began implementing the White Revolution, which was a plan to westernize the social and economic principles of the country. You can probably guess who might have played a role in influencing some of the policies in this new agenda. Many in the country voiced their opposition to the Shah's new plan for the nation. Some wanted to return to a more strict theocracy, while others just wanted to maintain the cultural heritage that their families had followed for generations. Unsurprisingly, the Shah used his newly formed intelligence agency to suppress resistance to his plan and made people who contradicted him disappear. It was a dark time that conservative Muslims used to gather support and unify like-minded individuals. As the Shah promoted the liberalization of the country, Shiite leaders advocated for a return to more traditional Islamic values. One of their major qualms with what the Shah was trying to do was that it allowed women too much freedom, something that would later be taken away as the years progressed. However, some good did come out of the reforms enacted during the White Revolution. In rural areas, literacy and health corps were sent to provide support and resources for the people living there. However, this did take away much of the autonomy that the groups living in rural Iran had enjoyed for most of history. It was in these communities some of the most conservative Islamic beliefs were held, and many deeply hated the changes being forced upon them. That being said, during this time, social and legal reforms were passed that gave women more freedom and autonomy. This upset many who had enjoyed a male-dominated society ever since Iran adopted the Islamic faith over 1,000 years ago. But for women, it changed everything. For the first time in centuries, it seemed they were on a path to equality. Some women were already in higher education at the time, but with the reforms, more and more women applied and were accepted into college. Part of the reason this occurred was that the government either convinced or forced families in the rural parts of Iran to allow their daughters to attend school away from home. More women started wearing Western-style clothing such as jeans, miniskirts, and short-sleeve tops. And while many women still wore hijabs, many chose not to. Large numbers of hairdressers began to pop up around cities and towns as women started to change their hairstyles, as now they didn't need to keep their heads covered. This was all happening as women's rights around the world were beginning to advance. It was by no means perfect, but it seemed like many countries were beginning to move toward the equality of the sexes. As we know, even now, this dream has not yet been achieved, but it was moving in the right direction in Iran. Then the Islamic Revolution happened. As women's rights and more liberal policies spread across the country in the late 60s and early 70s, Iran's economy started to pick up. Hundreds of women served on elected local councils and millions had jobs. There were female judges, ambassadors, and police officers. However, not everyone was happy and things weren't perfect. The Shah had almost unlimited power and was not always using it for good. Like any dictator would do, he used his influence and SAVAK to make sure that anyone who opposed him was silenced. At the same time, the Iranian people's expectations for their country's future began to rise. And while this was happening, the prices of oil and goods also began to rise. The Iranian people started to become more and more unhappy with the Shah and how he was running the country, as they couldn't afford certain necessities. The unfortunate part for the Shah was that he was so isolated from the discontent of the people that when he finally realized how unhappy they were, it was too late. Protests and riots began to break out. As protesters died at the hands of the military and police, people mourned them and condemned the monarchy. This vicious cycle continued for months. Protests were held, people died, and citizens became more enraged. The people of Iran were fed up with the Shah having unlimited power and not listening to their wishes. On September 8, 1978, the Shah declared martial law. It became very clear that he was losing control of the country, as martial law is always a last-ditch effort of a dictator to maintain control of their populace. Along with the protests breaking out across the nation, the workers in Iran's oil fields went on strike. This was followed by strikes in several other major industries. Rioting, mass demonstrations, and protests continued against the Shah's rule. Then, everything came crumbling to the ground. On January 16, 1979, the Shah fled Iran as he appeared to have lost all control of the country. Less than a month later, an Islamic nationalist who the Shah had exiled for political dissent, named Ayatollah Khomeini, returned to the country and stoked the fire of revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini and his supporters declared Iran a theocratic republic that would be ruled under Islamic principles. The new government removed all liberal representatives from their positions in a move to return Iran to more conservative social and religious values. And it was at this point women and many other people started to lose the rights they'd gained over the previous decades. It doesn't seem right that when the monarchy was removed and a republic was put into place that allowed for elected representatives, social norms would move backwards. But it's what happened next that explains why Iran developed into the oppressive country it is today. The Family Protection Act, which provided guarantees for many rights to women in marriage, was almost immediately abolished. Revolutionary bands of conservative men based out of mosques around the country, known as comités, began to patrol the streets of Iran to enforce Islamic dress codes and behaviors. These men acted as a militia to ensure anyone who opposed the revolution was silenced. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was formed as a religious army to fight against another coup set by the CIA. However, unlike the Mossadegh coup, this one failed and only emboldened the religious militias to unleash more brutality on anyone they suspected opposed the Islamic Revolution. At the end of the revolution, Iran ended up with a democracy and a constitution that appeared to allow people to elect officials they wanted. But it came with a few caveats that would allow men with conservative Islamic beliefs to both stay in power and influence the policies of the nation. The new government would consist of a president and representatives elected by the people. However, this government would be overseen by a supreme leader and a guardian council made up of Islamic religious officials. The supreme leader is the country's highest-ranking political, military, and religious authority. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini made himself the first supreme leader after returning to the country and taking control of the revolution. Regardless of who the Iranians elected as president, there would always be an unelected religious figure who outranked them. The Guardian Council was supposedly a mix of legal specialists and religious figures who had the ability to veto any legislation they believed went against Sharia law. This meant that the conservative policies enacted after the Islamic Revolution would likely never change until the Supreme Leader and Guardian Council were disbanded, or they too were elected by the people. Unfortunately, due to the status quo that developed after the Islamic Revolution, it doesn't seem like this will happen anytime soon. Even with the Islamic Revolution poised to take away certain rights for people, there was one thing that many Iranians hated more than what was happening in the government. 52 United States diplomats and citizens were taken hostage after a militia group of Muslim student followers of the Imam's line infiltrated the U.S. Embassy. The meddling of the United States as well as Britain in the affairs of Iran enraged people of all ages and beliefs. This led to a deep mistrust of Americans and resulted in many Iranian citizens preferring the new Islamic order to a dictator or government backed by a foreign power. As the Iranian people watched their revolution unfold and conservative religious laws become reinstated, women began to rally against wearing hijabs. However, the new Islamic government refused to listen. They mandated that all women wear hijabs, as is the custom in the Islamic faith. The religious militias enforced this mandate even though it was not technically a law until 1983. At that point, every female in the country, regardless of religious orientation or nationality, was required to wear a hijab. That law remains in place to this day. From 1979 to 1989, the new government made very little progress in terms of human rights. It was in 1989 that Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini died, and the Assembly of Experts made up of a body of senior clerics choose the outgoing president of Iran, Ali Khamenei, to take his place. Khamenei is still the Supreme Leader of Iran to this day. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, tensions between Iran and the United States remained high. This only fueled the anti-American sentiment carried by many Iranian citizens. At the same time, conservative religious leaders strengthened their grip on the country. Even though elections were held and women could vote, candidates had to be vetted and cleared by the Supreme Leader and the Guardian Council. This meant anyone who made it to the ballot was going to be religious and conservative, otherwise they would not be allowed to run. So, even though Iranian citizens could theoretically choose who represented them, their only choices were men who upheld conservative Islamic laws and would not oppose the Guardian Council or Supreme Leader's decisions. This meant that nothing would change until someone advocated for more equality and rights for all citizens. Then in 1997, Mohammad Khatami Ardakhani was elected president and pledged to enact political and social reforms that would allow more rights for women. In the year 2000, allies of Khatami won 189 out of the 290 seats of parliament, giving them the majority. It seemed as if more progressive policies would finally be passed. However, progress was slow. The Guardian Council and Supreme Leader stood in the way of reforms, and the hope to move away from conservative Islamic standards and toward more equality fell by the wayside. In 2004, conservatives reclaimed control of the parliament after highly controversial elections. In the following year, thousands of reformist candidates were barred from running by the Guardian Council, which stifled the progress made in the country. This was frustrating for many, and protests began to break out. In 2005, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, an ultra-conservative candidate, won the presidential election. It seemed as if the politics of Iran were moving in the wrong direction. Again, this was because the real power lay with the Supreme Leader and Guardian Council. The democracy of Iran was somewhat of an illusion because true reform would never be allowed to happen as long as the conservative religious bodies dictated who could run in an election and who couldn't. The results of these elections also seemed to be rigged when the conservative Islamic way of life was threatened. This almost always led to protests, with people either being locked up or killed by the government and police. In 2013, a centrist and reformist president was elected by the name of Hassan Rouhani. He advocated for more personal freedom, access to information, and an increase in women's rights. He appointed several women to his cabinet, including the first female foreign ministry spokesperson, Marzia Afkam. Rouhani was re-elected in 2017 and continued to move Iran toward more progressive goals. However, once again, in 2020, the Guardian Council intervened in the fight for equality and progressive laws. Conservatives swept many of the polls, with thousands of moderate candidates being refused the ability to run because they didn't meet the requirements of the religious governing body. In 2021, another blow was dealt to the fight for equality when Ibrahim Raisi, another ultra-conservative president, was elected. It also didn't help that the current supreme leader still believed that gender equality is one of the biggest misconceptions of Western thought. This brings us to what's happening right now in Iran. Women in the country are still forced to wear hijabs. Many are pushing the boundaries by literally pushing their hijab back as far as it'll go in a show of defiance. Backward laws, such as women not being able to leave the country to work without their husband's permission, are still in place. For example, one Iranian soccer player named Nilufar Ardalan wasn't allowed to play in a tournament in Malaysia when her husband forbade her from traveling. Women have been fighting for decades to regain the rights they lost after the Islamic Revolution. But again, until old men who are unwilling to relinquish their power or change the way they think are no longer allowed to dictate who can be elected and what laws can be passed in Iran, women and anyone who want to change the status quo in the country is fighting an uphill battle. However, women in Iran are strong and they have still managed to accomplish a lot, even under an oppressive government. Iranian women constitute 60% of higher education graduates, meaning more women graduate college than men in the country. In fact, Iran can also claim to have the first woman to win the Fields Medal, the most prestigious award in mathematics. Her name was Professor Maryam Mirzakhani, and she was brilliant. It's all of these impressive accomplishments in the face of such adversity that has the religious leaders of Iran and men in power so scared. As women and reformists in Iran gain more international notoriety and support, more and more pressure is being put on the current leaders to enact change. And since women make up a majority of the educated citizens in the country, and they clearly have strong voices and a willingness to advocate for equality, the oppressive rule of the conservative religious leaders in Iran might be coming to an end. More recently, Iranian women and school-aged girls have taken to the streets in protest against the killing of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini on September 16, 2022. She'd been detained days before for wearing her hijab too loosely. The police brutality around such an erroneous charge has led women to burn their hijabs and demand reform from the government. Iranian women are the driving force behind the protests and riots, but others are joining in as well. Anyone who wants reform and progressive change is rallying around the enraged women of Iran. The attention being given to these brave women in the media and the support shown by athletes, journalists, and activists around the world will make it very hard for the Iranian government to ignore the problem. And if they continue to condemn these women with brutal crackdowns and violence, it will only outrage the community further. Students are refusing to attend class in Iran, and women have walked out of their jobs, which could have repercussions on the economy. More and more Iranian organizations are backing these women, and if unions begin to strike as they did in 1978, it could lead to another revolution, a revolution where women lead the charge and reform the government so that equality is at the forefront. This is why the current Iranian government and religious leaders are so scared of the women in the country. They may not hold all the power, but they are smart, dedicated, and very, very angry. If we're to support the women fighting for their rights in Iran, we need to make sure the spotlight remains on them. Too often, Iran's nuclear dealings are the highlight of media attention, but if these protests and the outrage felt by many Iranians lead to a revolution, the international issues so many are concerned about could be fixed. If there's a real reform in Iran and people have an actual say in who's elected and who runs the country, there's a real possibility that Iran will become a vibrant democracy. This could fix a lot of the current political and foreign policy problems in the nation. We can't forget about the women and all Iranians who are desperately fighting for a better way of life. If governments are going to enter into deals or make policy changes in how they interact with Iran, women's rights must be a part of those negotiations. Any conversation about the future of Iran needs to include the equality these women are striving for. That being said, there are constant forces at work trying to suppress their voices and maintain the status quo. In Iran, this threat comes from old men holding on to outdated beliefs because it keeps them in power. Many Muslims outside of the control of oppressive regimes welcome equality and increased rights for all women. What's happening in Iran is not a religious issue, it's the result of bigotry and a subset of individuals wanting to maintain control over others. If the world's going to be a better place, females from every nation need to be given a good education, equality, and the opportunity to express themselves however they see fit. This is what the women of Iran are fighting for, and it should be what we all fight for. Now watch what would happen if the USA and Iran went to war, 2022 military army comparison, or check out Iran military intercepts alien UFO.